Good evening. Thank you for joining Performance in Context tonight for a conversation with Salon Séance Artistic Director and Violinist Mari Lee and researcher Simon Lee. They're the co-founders of Salon Séance that will be performing two times in this next weekend, Saturday at the Sanctuary for Independent Media and Sunday at the Linda, WAMC's performing arts venue. I'm Jennifer Larson. I'm president of Friends of Chamber Music of Troy, New York. And on behalf of Friends of Chamber Music, I'd like to welcome everyone. So first, I'd like to welcome Simon, if you'll just sort of wave. He is the researcher, the historian, one of the two co-founders of Salon Séance, together with Mari Lee, the creator of this particular program, The End of Time, and violinist, wonderful violinist, I must say. You're welcome. So let's start with what Salon Séance is. Is it an artist collective? Do you have permanent members? Is it just lean and mean, you and Simon and one other person, and depending on what idea you have in mind, you draw from a larger pool of musicians? Can you talk a little about what it is?
Yeah, so Salon Séance is, I would say, it's a production company, and it's also name of the concept that's central to every program we create. And yeah, we work with different artists and collaborators for each program, and I guess I curate the group for each program as an artistic director. But to tell you a little bit more about what Salon Séance is, so we create experiential concerts that channel timeless human stories through the ritual of séance. And by combining live music, storytelling, and participatory ritual, we bring audiences, performers, and composers to the intersection between music and our lives.
So in a way, you think like an educator, how to convey these abstract ideas in as visceral a manner as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say it's like, as a performer, I guess like this is very much a performer's perspective of, how to communicate the essence of music. And yeah, I'm trying to share what goes on when we are really like channeling these composers' intentions and messages through their musical language. Because for me, it goes way beyond just, a series of beautiful notes, that sound wonderful as a listener, but it carries more than that. It's like what these people, how they saw the world, the kind of experience they had as human beings. And I think the reason why we still listen to this music today is because these masterworks carry messages that are universal and that are timeless and still resonate with us, regardless of, the time we live in and where we are from. Mm-hmm. And so that it's it's our way of sharing that experience with as many people as possible.
So I wanted to talk about how you formed Salon Séance. As a violinist, did you have previous experience curating programs and pulling in artists beyond musicians? Or was this something that was entirely out of the box for you?
For me, it was definitely Salon Séance was the first time I work with people outside of music. Mm-hmm. But I guess like the thing that really started Salon Séance for me was when I interacted for the first time with people outside of music and being shocked by how, hostile they were to the idea of classical music. And this was back in Japan. I just turned 20 and I was back in Japan for a semester for family reasons. And I needed to find a job and I couldn't find one because I hadn't lived in, it's where I'm from, but I hadn't lived in Japan since I was 11. And so I ended up working at a restaurant. And yeah, I was for the first time in my life surrounded by people who knew nothing about classical music. And I just took it for granted that everybody appreciated it, and they appreciated the craft that I worked all my life, perfecting. And there I was without my instrument, without anything. And, they were like, well, it's like what rich people do to show off their money. Or, like it's like from the West, and it has nothing to do with us. Like, why should we care? And I couldn't answer these questions because I never really asked myself those questions before. And why am I doing this? What is the value of classical music today? Why should somebody like that, like who has nothing to relate to, listen to it? And so that's kind of like, I wanted to really bridge that gap, because to me, classical music goes beyond, these ideas and how they're marketed in the world. To me, it was something that was kind of a passport in the world. Like it made me see the world, and go from this little community in Japan to England and all these other countries where I studied, and eventually to like international venues, and to share the beauty of this language that can move so many people. So that's kind of where it began. So I would say Salon Séance was the first time I really exposed myself to the world outside of music.
Mm-hmm. So I must say, Simon is Mari's brother. And so are you close in age? Did you grow up hearing Mari play, and did you also play an instrument?
I also played an instrument, but not professionally, right? So as an amateur, the flute. But yeah, so I'm 2.5 years younger than my sister. And I do have early memories of staying back at home on my own, as my mother took my sister to, violin competitions or whatever. And sometimes I would hear her perform, but most of the time I would hear her practicing. So I never heard whole pieces, just passages over and over again. And I still do sometimes, because I'm staying with my sister in New York right now. So I'm exposed to that as well. But yeah, so not much has changed in that respect.
So what did music mean to you as an amateur and not a professional?
Well, so I grew up listening to classical music a lot because of my sister. I was, I was more open to other genres, whereas my sister had to really just focus on her particular art. But then I think so. Yeah, I think most of my youth, I listened to non-classical music more than classical music. But I still, would listen to it now and again and go to my sister's performances and so on. And it was only really after my final year of university that I started really thinking about classical music as a point of research, right, for me. And much of that was due to provocation from my sister, who was looking for ways to communicate the meaning content of the music she was performing to her audience, rather than taking it for granted that the audience would understand. I mean, that's how it usually is in concerts, right? You go, you sit, you listen, you applaud, and then you go back home, and you just expected to know what the music means. But because I would say there's a prejudice that's quite common among musicians and also concert goers that goes unchallenged, namely that music speaks for itself, right? That it's some kind of a, you know, direct form of communication, and that you know, there's no need to theorize or, you know, have extensive background knowledge. But we think this is, you know, utter rubbish, to be honest. And musicians know this more than anyone, because what do they do when they practice and rehearse these pieces? Is that they struggle, right? They struggle to make sense, and they talk to, you know, each other, their collaborators. You know, what does this passage mean? What does the composer intend? And it's really the question of intention, right? That's really at the forefront. So and that's based. And I was coming at a similar kind of issue from the perspective of cultural history, right? And trying to understand the significance of these works. What did the composer want to say with these works? Who are his intended audience? And, you know, what kind of effect did he or she want, you know, in writing this piece, and so on. So although in Murray's case, it may be more focused, right? These questions, like certain passages, certain markings in a particular piece. And I was kind of asking more from looking at it from a broader perspective. Essentially, was doing the same thing. And once we realized that, we knew that, you know, it would be better if we combined these two approaches, right, to the same question.
This, you know, the name of this interview program that we do, Performance in Context, is identical to your intention.
That's what we do.
Because I feel that it's helpful for people to have an idea about the time, the history, the motivations of the composers or the performers, and not only is it useful for them as they then listen to the music afterwards, but these are ideas that are important. They're important to talk about. So yeah, it totally resonates with me. It makes me wonder about your parents that produced two highly creative and thoughtful individuals. I mean, what was your home life like?
Oh.
What can we say?
I don't know.
Are we allowed? I don't know.
Well, actually, we left home quite early. So I left when I was 11, and Simon left when he was 9. We both studied boarding schools in the UK. I went to a specialist music school, and you went to
a normal school.
Normal, yeah, normal.
You went to the Menuhin school, is that right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. That's
very peculiar school, I would
very
say.
peculiar school, right? A very special school.
I would say that because we were both living separately, right? Not just from our parents, but also from each other. There was rarely a time for us to kind of, you know, hang out together as we were growing up. And then Mari went off to university in the US, and I went to university in the UK. So that, you know, that kind of situation prolonged itself. And it was through this project, which started in 2015, that we were able to find a way to, you know, not just hang out together, but to work together, right? And so it has that kind of significance for us as well.
It must be a joy to collaborate.
Yeah, it's nice.
So I know that this performance that we'll be seeing this weekend is not your first example of this kind of immersive performance. What was the first one?
It was Schoenberg.
Yeah, 2015.
And actually, Simon was Schoenberg.
So yeah, the reason was, so yeah, this goes back to the question of like how Salon Séance started. And before it was called Salon Séance, it was called Evolving Traditions. That was the Schoenberg performance. But the concept is essentially the same. And it came out of, basically, Schoenberg is a notoriously difficult composer, right, for the audience. And so, and Mari wanted to perform his works. But, you know, she had already started thinking about and trying to find ways to make these works, especially modern works, accessible to the general audience. And she was trying to contextualize these works during the performance, right? With these, small lectures, introducing the pieces. And but she was quite busy, and she basically tried to outsource this bit to me. And she knew that I was doing cultural, historical research into, Vienna around the turn of the century. So, I was quite familiar with that context. And initially, the idea was to, give a lecture before the pieces, each piece, or maybe, before the entire performance, there would be like a 30-minute lecture or something. And I was used to that. I'd been to lecture concerts before. I'm sure you have too. But when it finally came to, me being the one, to go on stage and do this, I felt very uncomfortable because I never really liked lecture concerts. And I couldn't really figure out what it was that I didn't like about them. But as I was doing my research into Schoenberg, went to Vienna, went to the Schoenberg archives, all this kind of stuff, and thinking about ways to, kind of format the lecture, I realized that the best way to communicate to the audience what Schoenberg wanted to do, what his intentions were with these pieces, is in essence to recreate my own research process that allow me to get close to that, right, to these intentions. I read his letters, his essays, and these things really showed me, what he wanted to do with these works. But how do I communicate that in a 30-minute lecture? That was my big problem. And so one day I just came up with the idea that, okay, what if it was in the composer's voice? So it wasn't some lecturer who's, like a know-it-all, just telling, the audience, from above, what the work means. If it actually came from the voice of the composer, as it was for me when I was reading, his own writings, Schoenberg's writings, then perhaps that would, that kind of pretense, right? Even though it is a pretense, would make it easier to, understand this message. So I told Mary, okay, what if we do it in the voice of Schoenberg? And I think she was like, well, what do you mean by that, in the voice of Schoenberg? And I just said, well, like, I'll just pretend to be Schoenberg on stage. And she was quite skeptical at the beginning, I think. But then, and I also didn't know how this would turn out, but, we just went with it. And then it was people liked it. At the time, and we performed in Berlin, the kind of first iteration of this. And then I think it was 3 years later in 2018, right?
End of 17.
2017, end of 2017. We thought about doing it again, but with a different composer, this time Benjamin Britten. So I did the research for that, went to Opera, went to the archives, all that stuff. And then by this time we were thinking about, okay, but we should maybe, change the name, because Evolving Traditions is kind of Schoenberg, like it's a reference to something Schoenberg said. So something, broader, because if we're going to do it with other composers, it has to be something. And Mari was like, well, it's like a kind of salon, right? Because we are bringing the audience, the composer, or the composer's spirit, right? And the musician and research, together, right? So it's kind of a meeting place of all these different interests. So it's like a salon. And then the Séance part came from me just, I was just kind of brainstorming names. And I just said, why not just call it Séance de musique, French, which just means, music session. But, in English, séance means something different as well. So I thought it was a kind of funny pun. Well, not very funny. But Mari was insistent that we have Salon in the name. So we said, okay, well, what if we do Salon Séance? And then that's how it came about.
Really a brilliant title. I remember when I met you, Mari, for the first time. You pitched this idea in a workshop we were in, Chamber Music America. And I remember thinking, but to see it in practice, it's remarkable. The hairs on my arms were standing on end.
Oh, thank you.
But to try something out of the box like that, I guess you had several artistic choices you could have made. You could have used recorded voices or incorporated video, but the fact that you chose to do it with a person, it makes all the difference in the world. I saw something similar not that employed elements of the voice of the muse behind the composition, but they did it with a recorded voice, and it didn't work the same way. To have a body there present, embodying the composer, really works in a very special way, I think. It gives it a cohesiveness and a depth that I think is really, really very cool. You're welcome. And I do mean that because I've thought about this quite a bit. It's something that ensembles and musicians right now struggle with, trying to be relevant, and also trying to draw connections between the classical arts and more popular genres, or to branch out with collaborations with dancers and other non-musician artist traditions. And often that comes across as feeling like an add-on. And this does not feel like an add-on. It feels like a body of work all its own, which I think is really remarkable. So I know that when you perform, you have certain skills that you really, work very hard on. And then you're also in conservatory, and they're teaching you, well, you probably need to have a website, and this is what a website should have, and this is how to write a bio. But doing something like this requires vastly more than that. So I wonder if you might talk about some of the things you had to learn. And
where should I begin?
and that maybe you're still learning. Yeah, you could start.
Yeah, I mean, that I don't think it'll ever stop, I feel like I'll always have to learn. I mean, just like in music, and just like in life, it's never-ending process of learning. But I would say the most important thing that I learned was, of course, you need, different types of skills, like, as you said, like how to write your bio, how to do accounting, and, PR, marketing, whatever, fundraising, all these things. But I think the most difficult in the end is to have a very strong vision that would bring everything together. Because you can find people who have these skills, and you can hire them, but in the end, even if you have all these people, you need that thing that unites everyone. And when you have that strong urge and you are able to communicate that, people want to do it with you and for you. And to verbalize that and to really emit that through your craft, through your being, your energy. I think that's the most important thing I learned, because that's not something you can necessarily just learn at school, but it's something you discover by, a lot of self-reflection, but also like working with other inspiring artists, and not just artists, just, inspiring people, and taking in different things and what it is, like just analyzing what it is that draws you to those people. Yeah, so I would say that's the most important thing that I learned. Of course, yeah, I mean, many skills, including, how to think not like a musician. Yeah, because we come from such a, so specialized, I mean, within music itself, I mean, already classical music is very, specialized, but then within classical music, it's becoming more and more specialized, right? Like which era of music you specialize in. Like you could be an early music person, you could be a new music person, everything in between. You could be doing solo or chamber music, or, and then you have your own particular niche within that, right? To differentiate yourself. But this is all within such a small pool of people. right?
Mhm.
And yeah, I think I just wanted to understand music in a different way, because I realized the more specialized we become, and I became, and you have to do that also, right, to really perfect your craft. But I just realized I was moving further away from music
Mhm.
because I found myself talking not so much about music. I was just talking about, business. I mean, not business, but like who got which gig, like, oh, what I was doing next. Like, it had nothing to do with it. Nobody, like, I couldn't find people who talked passionately about music.
Mhm.
It's actually very rare to talk about um music in the music industry, which is very, very sad. And then I just thought to myself, well, no wonder like nobody's interested, because like actually musicians who are doing this are completely incapable of talking passionately about music in comprehensible ways.
That is a very funny observation. So you found it sounds like you jumped in, you did the Schoenberg thing, and then you thought, why am I doing this? And it was self um, discovery, I guess. That was the process afterwards. That's very interesting to try to understand your own motivations for doing something that you had to be um, you had to be really determined. You had to work out a lot of details. You had to take a risk. And all of that tells me that you were highly motivated by something. And which, so it was after that that you then looked back and said, this is what I'm trying to do.
I would say for me, it goes back to that experience I had at the restaurant, and really for the first time being in contact with people who had no idea about music, and realizing my incapable my incapability of like communicating the value of music.
Mhm.
That to me was, I mean, I couldn't forgive myself.
So
So that was the moment. That was like the motivation behind all of this. I really wanted people to understand my passion for it.
so did you feel that classical music was something that potentially everybody could enjoy or embrace?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have that same feeling too, and that there's something so human about music in general, that the best music is pretty universal, but people just need to have a chance to see it up close in the right situations, in a situation that's not intimidating and so forth. So since your first experiments, how has your model changed? Have you found yourself doing things different, tweaking things, but keeping it roughly the same? Or how have things changed since that first one?
Well, as I said, I was playing Schoenberg in the very first one. And we realized that if we want to do it properly, we need an actual actor, and so we tried that for a few years, right? Yeah. And then also I was kind of I think in the first performance it was kind of half written but half improvised. And because I had all this knowledge in my head that I could just use, and I was hoping to do a Q&A even so I could answer people on the spot, but actually we didn't do that. It was too risky. But yeah, also if we do it with an actor, they can't do this kind of thing, right? Everything has to be scripted. So we needed a script writer, right? A playwright to collaborate with. So it kind of evolved from there. So we just identified these specific things, in the concept that could be improved, right? And most of that meant, inviting professionals, right? Other professionals in these fields. So then it became not just a music thing, but also music and, like dramatic arts kind of thing. And that's where the collaborative thing kind of really stems from.
Mhm.
But I would say that it's always evolving.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think the reason is because to really find a way to, like, going back to what you said initially, like about present, like, how do you find a format where you can communicate to the audience your process of what goes on, like when you are doing all this research. It's kind of the same for performers, right?
Mhm.
Like, you have all this process, you're practicing every day for days and weeks and years, and it's almost impossible to really share all of that in such a short period of time. And how to do that, I mean, we, of course, like, you have to experiment a lot. And but now I feel like we have, well, I guess, experimented over the course of last 5+ years.
Mhm.
And it's
No,
been
seven. It's 7.
it's
7
now
years.
approaching 7 years, but
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like we kind of come back a full circle in some ways. I mean, of course, like, a lot of things have changed, but I feel like, like, having collaborated with theater artists and having seen a little bit, I mean, I would never call myself like a theater maker, but having collaborated with them, I realized, like, actually there are many similarities between the classical music field and theater in the relationship between the creator and the performer and the audience. It's basically the same, right?
Mhm.
Like, somebody writes the text, and then there's somebody performing it, and then somebody perceiving that.
Mhm.
But I just wanted to find a way to break this.
Mhm.
So now we are in the process, like, how do we break this wall without, like, obviously breaking the beauty of that format and the quality that you get through that.
Mhm.
You mean the separation between the audience and the performers, right?
Yeah,
Breaking that
and
wall.
the creator, because you were like, oh,
Oh,
like,
okay. Yeah.
like, the creator is like, well, the composer is the king, right? Like, we try to really serve, like, their intention and message, but, like, how do we bring those things, like the three different elements, I mean, or parties, right?
Yeah, parties. To the same
to the
table.
same level, because we're essentially trying to connect with human message, right? Something that we experience in life. And how can we explore that together rather than saying, oh, this person wrote this amazing thing and we as performers are trying to recreate that, and then there you are coming to watch that,
Mhm.
And so, like, I would say what we're trying to create, like, the experience we're trying to create in the space is, like, not that we create this beautiful cake with, like, really, like, all these beautiful details, and we just, like, carry to the stage and show it to you, but rather, like, let's make this together. Let's explore what kind of ingredients we have and what is the process of making this beautiful cake,
Mhm.
and let's make one that is unique to that specific day.
Mhm.
And so that's the kind of connection and relationship we want to create in the space.
So I noticed a lot of your productions had something to do with war. They were composers who wrote about war or during wartime, or like Benjamin Britten, for instance. Is there a particular draw to those sorts of composers or that kind of material?
So when we were kind of coming up with a list of potential composers we can do after Schoenberg, right? So this was like 2016 or 17. We were kind of brainstorming, and because of the research that goes into it, like trying to figure out the composer's intention through archival research, it needed to be composers that had a lot of archival material. And so modern composers tend to have a lot more, like letters and essays and, all these kind of things are preserved. Whereas, you go back farther in time and then, many things get lost, right? So it came from, that kind of practical necessity, I think. But at the same time, I think we're at the point where, we don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to modern composers, but so far it has tended to be modern composers, yes.
And so the experience of modern life has been war. I mean,
Exactly. 20th century, is very much a century of war.
like now, which is really terrible. Yeah, it's I feel like in bringing that material to life now, it probably helps people grapple with today's problems, or
And
yeah.
and music is a form of expression, right? So what ultimately what gets these composers to, what drives them, right? Why do they even create these works in the first place? Because they have something to say, something to express, right? And that comes from, experiences that they have as human beings, right? So and many of these people live through war firsthand, sometimes 2 wars, right? Or several. So although the music itself may not be a direct representation, right, of specific experiences they've had, the motivation for creating music is very much influenced by, these kind of events. And that's something that I've found, doing this research, Mari and me both, it's. And in the Britain, we certainly explored that theme of how music can be a way to, it could be a way for not just the composer, but for other people, who can be there as the audience or as performers, to really try to grapple with, the emotional consequences of these events, like war.
What
Music is about emotions at the end of the day. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. I'm gonna back up a little bit, because as a grown-up performer, you're informed by the research that you've done. You've looked at the original scores, you've seen Beethoven's markings and read his letters and so forth. As a child performer, none of that material is examined except by way of the teacher, who will say some things, right? Did you feel as a child some kind of kinship with Bach, for instance, when you were playing Bach, even without knowing much about Bach? And how did that change as you became more informed?
Yeah, I definitely did. I mean, for me, the first time I really was truly moved by music was when I was actually 8 or 9. It's around the time I started playing violin. Actually, I started quite late, and it was this G minor sonata for violin and piano by Handel, and I will never ever forget that experience, because somehow for the first time in my life I felt like truly understood. Because the emotional music captured this, like, it was a range of emotions. I mean, it was very sad, but at the same time, it was beautiful, and it was like happy, but at the same time, I could feel some like notes of despair, and like, I don't know, I just felt like I was living that music. And I never felt that way in my life until that point. And we both come from this community of Koreans in Japan, and so our last names are Lee, as you know, which is quite, I mean, it is, I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but in Japan, for example, like the school I went to, like there were no other Koreans, or I mean, these are mostly Japanese kids, and so I was usually bullied at school, and that kind of isolation and discrimination I experienced was like something that I lived with as a child, and it was through music that I really felt like something understood me for the first time, that like the people around me or kids around me didn't understand. And yeah, and that goes, I mean, that was way before I knew anything about music theory and all of this stuff. But it was that feeling of being understood by something much greater than, day-to-day things that I experienced. And yeah, I would say that, but of course, like as I learned more things, yes, like there are certain explanations, that I could come up with, like why I felt certain way at a certain time because of this key change or whatever. But I think but the essence of that experience is still what drives me and motivates me to practice every day and to pursue this path. And I don't think that'll ever change, and I don't think I'll ever forget that experience.
Mhm. I had a very interesting experience in Abu Dhabi. I hosted these listening sessions for students who didn't know classical music or Western music really at all. They hadn't seen a string instrument up close. They certainly had never played it. And I had a friend who was a librarian. So we would bring students in who were poets to listen to music. This was our idea. We would have them listen to music that they would then have a chance to use to stimulate their Arabic poetry.
Hmm.
And then they would go to the concert months later and work with musicians to pair their poetry with the music. So on one occasion, it was 4 women, and we were listening to the Grosse Fugue, and which you would think would be so wild to somebody who doesn't know music at all, but it's all wild. It might have been Janacek. It could have been anything. It was all new to them. And at the end, they were very quiet, and one said, "I think he really meant it," which was so astute. And honestly, from that point on, I believe that that we have something in us that makes us able to receive and feel the abstract ideas in music, even difficult music like Beethoven's Grosse Fugue. So just that little story. So I wanted to know, if you felt also as a child that you wanted to communicate something as you played. Was that something that goes way back, or was that something that you realized later when you discovered people didn't necessarily appreciate your art form?
I think, yeah, there was always an urge to communicate, but it was like to communicate what I was feeling. Like this amazing experience that I had, like what I just told you about, like Handel Sonata. I just had this connection with it that I needed to share, because I wanted other people to experience it too. So that's what it was, and I mean that's still the case, Yeah.
As a historian, I imagine as you wander in the world of a certain time period or a certain group of characters, do you similarly feel driven to share that with others?
Yeah, so it's quite similar actually to what performers do, right? Because what do performers do? They try to communicate not like their own message, but someone else's, right? Like the composers. I mean, that's what essentially they're doing. And sometimes they also get a personal payoff because it could be expressing something they also feel, right? So and that's the great thing about composers, that they can speak in this language that can also become someone else's words, right? Like just like when you listen to a great great song, right, with lyrics, and you sing it yourself, it's because these words seem to speak to your emotions, and you can make them your own words, right? So something similar I think is happening with music, even without words. But yeah, with history as well, like you're looking at lives especially if you do cultural social history, you're looking at lives of past people, real people who lived in this world. And what you're trying to do is reconstruct that, right? Not just reconstruct their words, but also reconstruct the meaning that they imbued behind those words and experiences, and then try to communicate that to someone else, right? So in that sense, we historians and performers are both mediums, right? They are channeling someone else, right? But they're not doing it just to be, but in channeling, something else emerges at the same time, like something that speaks to us, in the present now, yeah, I think that's what we are exploring, essentially, right?
Right. We have about 15 minutes left, and before we finish, I want to talk a little about the program that people have a chance to see this next weekend. Could you sort of introduce Olivier Messiaen for the audience? I know that the Quartet for the End of Time is something that's played a lot by string players, especially chamber players, but it's not often on the programs that people see. And so can you tell us who Messiaen was, and maybe something about this Quartet for the End of Time, where it falls in Messiaen's work?
Yeah, well, Messiaen is a French composer. He's a modern composer. He lived in the 20th century. And he writes, well, he's usually writes music that has some kind of religious content, right? But that's how he's perceived anyway. And he writes mostly abstract music. A lot of music for organ. He wrote only one opera, which is very long, based on the life of Saint Francis. This piece, though, comes I think it was in his 30s, right, when he wrote the piece. Yeah. So he's still kind of finding his own language, right? Finding his own voice. And this piece is basically a turning point in that journey of self-discovery, right, as an artist. He himself has said that this was a piece, where he finally found his musical language, right, his own individual musical language. And he found it, in a prisoner of war camp, right? Because that's where most of the movements for this particular quartet was composed. And so, that's a very complicated background to the piece. So any performer, right, who's going to perform this has to look at that complicated genesis. And we're trying to kind of present that to the audience as well, but with a twist, because we're not just bringing Messiaen's voice, right, to the audience. We're bringing the voice of the people who performed at the premiere of the piece. So we're not describing Messiaen just through his own voice, but through the voice of the people who knew him and who were actually intimately involved in the process of creating this piece.
So he did some experimental things involving time that I think maybe he was already working with these ideas of palindromic rhythms, but they show up here for sure. Can you sort of give people a few things that they might listen for?
I mean, I think that's very difficult to decipher just from listening, because it is very it is layered, and to actually hear the rhythmic pattern that reflects like the eternity and all of that is, even for musicians, pretty challenging. So the most immediate thing I would pay attention to is the sheer slowness of some of the movements, and how that is almost impossible for the performers.
Mhm.
For example, the cello solo movement and the violin solo movement at the end. I mean, it gets slower and slower. And my movement, so because I'm a violinist, the violin movement at the end is like 8 notes equals, I think 36 or something like this. And so it's extremely, extremely slow. And I don't think I know any other piece, at least that I've played so far in my life, that's as slow as this. And there is that kind of, I guess, struggle, obviously, of playing these long notes. But beyond that struggle is something magical. And I think that's something that he was trying to communicate, and maybe reflects the experience of the 4 original musicians who were stuck in this prisoner of war camp. And I also we just performed this, just the music and not the production, but we just performed it 2 days ago.
Mhm.
And having played it again, and now that it's fresh in my memory, I would say that it is definitely a piece that you need to experience live, both as a listener and as a performer. And from the performer's perspective, I would say that when you're just rehearsing or practicing on your own, and you're just, practicing the little parts where you play, because you don't always play. Every movement has different instrumentation. But there is something about watching your colleagues struggle through these very, very, very slow movements that, like, you see the vulnerability there.
Mhm.
And like somehow you are sharing this experience together. And there is that kind of, it's very hard to describe, but the certain kind of bonding that you kind of feel through this music and through the struggle. But when you make it through that struggle, and you're feeling them too. I mean, you're like literally right next to them. And sometimes, it's really like you're holding these long notes and you're really like shaking or like trying to sustain as long as possible. And that experience is actually beautiful, that you experience together. And I think, I've heard this piece performed by other musicians many, many times also. And yeah, just that experience as a listener also is something that translates, just kind of feeling the time expand and,
Mhm.
wondering, what is this? What is this? What does it mean? Yeah, and I hope that that comes across in our production as well, because that's definitely something we talk about.
Yeah, and Messiaen said about this piece that that you have these beautiful divine melodies, right, in the piece, but also the silences, right? And he emphasized like it's the silences are really beautiful as well. So I would advise the audience to listen out for the silences, right, and how they're used and what they signify, right, in the particular moments when they're employed. Yeah.
I've always thought that the title of the piece was a huge puzzle for me, because of course it refers to the book of Revelation, and he was a mystical Catholic. And the book of Revelation feels to me to be so violent, but he was not. He did not have a negative view of the world.
Yeah, so it's not the entire book that is adapted for this piece. It's actually just specifically this one image in chapter 10 about the 7th angel, who consummates, right, the mysteries of God. I think that's the passage. But it's this idea of consummation, right? That all of historical time, right, has finally come to an end, but it's a fulfillment. It's not like an abrupt cut or anything like that. So the end here is more like, like the end goal, like means and ends, that kind of end, right? That's what he means by that. So yeah, so I don't think the piece actually portrays any of the calamities that the previous 6 angels bring about prior to chapter 10 of the Revelations. It's really just this idea of like, what does it mean for all of this, like the world we're living in, history that we are, historical time that we're living in. What does it mean for all of this to be fulfilled, right? And the mysteries of living in historical time, because Messiaen was stuck in a prisoner of war camp, and he was wondering, why is this happening to me? Why me? And why is war happening in this world? And there are so many mysteries, about this world that we live in, which is in time. And he's kind of looking forward in this kind of desperate situation to some kind of fulfillment that would give meaning to all of this, right? This experience. So that's how he wanted the phrase "end of time" to be interpreted. And he actually did say that this is not a pun. I'm not punning on like the fact that there was a war at the time I was writing it. No. It's very specific.
Really fascinating. Well, I see that we have some participants who may wish to join in and ask a question. You are, I believe, Shay, are you behind the scenes here?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So Shay will invite you to unmute if you would like to ask your questions in person, or you can type them into the chat box if you like, but don't feel under any pressure to do so. We just have a minute or so left, but I want to make sure and give anyone who's listening tonight a chance to weigh in. This has been fascinating, by the way, and I really appreciate you joining me this evening.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Very fun.
Well,
Well, I think we will pull this together.
There's something
Oh,
like
there's
Q&A.
something-
We have a question. We actually have a question. Okay.
Where?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay, so as for the next event, just go to our website, salonseance.com, and look at the events page.
Yeah, there is one in New York City, in Long Island City on Thursday. And then there are 2 shows presented by Friends of Chamber Music Troy.
Right, one on Saturday in Troy, the Sanctuary for Independent Media, and one on Sunday at the Linda, WAMC's Performing Arts venue. And you can go on the Friends of Chamber Music website to purchase your tickets, or you can purchase them at the door. And the next question was, do two of you ever have any conflicts?
I mean, of course, we're brother and sister, we have conflicts all the time. But when it comes to this project, I think we both have, the same end goal, right? So it's never really conflict, I would say. Just, different views. But, it's nice to have different views, and then we can kind of really nail down what it is that we want to do, because it's bigger than us. It's bigger than just me or my sister or the other collaborators individually. It's something we're all kind of trying to do something. We have an idea of it, and it's always kind of our interpretation of that idea is always changing, as Mario mentioned earlier. So we all approach this project from a place of modesty and humility, right? About none of us pretend that we have the exact like interpretation, because it's all about the searching process and doing that searching process together, right? That's what this is all about. And we both know how lonely it is when that searching process is just done alone, right? And that's what we both, I think, get out of this project, right? Is being able to ask questions and figure out, the depths of these works, right? Not just those works, but these big questions, right? And about humanity, about history, that these composers are tackling as well. Like, we're all engaging in this and trying to, help each other on their way to answering life's, eternal questions.
Well, for me, it's really interesting because, we are all interpreting music together, but, we have non-musicians as well, right? So I'm interpreting music as a musician, which I've been doing all my life, but then I have a historian, I have director, I have actor, and to kind of hear how they interpret this music that I've known for decades is always fascinating. And I welcome the conflicts. Well, should we say it's not really conflict, but just different points of view, because it does add a fresh take on the music that has, I mean, I wouldn't say it can become stale, say, but when you play this so many times, you just kind of get into a certain routine and certain way of interpreting and playing. But I think any musician would try every single performance to discover something new, right? And working with people from other fields within the arts is always fascinating.
I think rather than kind of treating them as treating these different viewpoints as conflicting views, I think we treat them as partial views that build up to a whole. That's the hope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's good to have these challenges, where your interpretation is when it's challenged, you try to defend it, but then also sometimes you can't answer the question because they're spot on.
Right.
And it just adds another layer and more depth to what we create.
Right. And sometimes it's only when you are defending your position that you finally kind of put it into words, and then so you find out something about yourself, right? So it's so many expressive kind of acts being performed, not just on stage, but backstage, in this way.
Well, I am thrilled that you'll be coming to Albany to show us your vision of this work and your vision of your work together with your other musicians and other artists. And I'm delighted that Friends of Chamber Music is able to bring you here. So have a good night.
Excited.
Oh, that's I'm so excited. I hope those of you who listen tonight will make one of the concerts or maybe both of the concerts, and everybody have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.